Hello and welcome to another edition of At Issue. I'm Matt Pritchard in for Corey Smith. Sue O'Connell will join us a little bit later. In just a minute, New Hampshire Senator Jeanne Shaheen is in studio to talk about a number of different issues, including the first presidential debate. Now, it was the earliest such meeting in U.S. history, and it was not President Joe Biden's best night. In fact, there was downright panic expressed by some Democrats afterwards. Sue's going to offer her take and what we should expect moving forward. Joining me to discuss the debate and much more is New Hampshire Senator Jeanne Shaheen. Senator, thanks so much for joining us in studio. We sure appreciate your time.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with the debate. We're taping this on Friday, so it just happened last night. A lot of people have looked back and said this was a weak performance for Joe Biden, the President of the United States. What was your impression as you were watching?
Well, I think everybody who watched thought it was a bad night for Joe Biden. And it was unfortunate because so much of what Donald Trump said was not accurate, misleading. He again doubled down on he won the election in 2020. He refused to condemn the insurgency on January 6th. He lied again about his conviction in New York State. Mm-hmm. And he really tried to take credit for a number of things that have happened over the last 3.5 years under President Biden. So it's unfortunate. Again, was not a good night, and hopefully people will continue to stay focused on the 3.5 years that Joe Biden has been president. And it reminds us how much is at stake in this upcoming election. There are two very different visions for the country that are at stake. And so the important thing for the campaign over the next months is to let people know that Joe Biden stands for working families, that he's interested in trying to ensure that the future of the country is stable. And what Donald Trump has stood for is himself, basically. And he's, when he was president, he weakened the country, tried to take us out of NATO, which is a topic we're going to talk about this morning. Exactly. So it's a reminder of just how much is at stake in this election. I
can tell the way you're using your words, I can probably forecast the answer to this next question. But a lot of Democrats are saying, is it time to move on from Joe Biden? 60 plus days until the convention. Do you need to find another candidate in your mind for your party?
Well, I think there are going to be a lot of discussions post last night's debate. And again, I hope people will stay focused on the choice that we have come November and remember what Donald Trump meant for the country when he was in office, the chaos that followed him, the botched effort to address COVID. All of those things are important to remind people about.
Do you still think, though, Joe Biden is the strongest candidate for the Democratic Party?
Well, again, I think there will be discussions about what needs to happen next. And Joe Biden is going to, I'm sure, assess how he did in the debate and what we need to do in the country.
Let's switch over to some of the substantive topics that they got into. Ukraine may be the first one that we can get into. This war has been going on for nearly 3 years at this point. We know Donald Trump and Joe Biden have very different visions for how they would move forward with this conflict. What's your impression of where this stands right now and how America is responding to it?
Well, one of the really unexpected responses, I think, for Vladimir Putin was that when he invaded Ukraine, what it did was to bring the NATO alliance together, to make it stronger. We've added Finland and Sweden to the alliance, which adds tremendous expertise in the Arctic Circle and the Baltic Sea. So I think what has happened as the result of the war in Ukraine has been critical for our own national security, because what we did with our Ukraine National Security Supplemental Bill was to invest in our own defense industrial base, about $25 billion. We invested in our submarine industrial base, which is important for us who look at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in the seacoast of New Hampshire and Maine. We also, it was a wake-up call in terms of how prepared we are should we be attacked directly. And what we've learned is that we've got a lot of work to do with our defense industrial base, that we need to make sure that we have what we need to defend our own country. And NATO is a big piece of that. I was in the Indo-Pacific back in March, and we visited the Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, and Japan. And one of the things that really struck me in the meetings that we had with leaders was just how focused they were on what was happening in the war in Ukraine, and the recognition that what happens in Ukraine has a huge impact on what happens with China in the South China Sea, what happens with Taiwan, a recognition that she is watching very closely. Are the allies going to stay together? Are we going to follow up on the commitment we made to Ukraine? And it's not just our allies who are watching that, who are making sure that we're all together, but it's our adversaries. China, Russia, of course. The recent agreement that Russia signed with North Korea shows just how important what happens in Ukraine is for North Korea and their future missile program. And Iran, which of course we know is doing lots of things across the Middle East, in Gaza, in Syria, to destabilize the Middle East. And again, they are providing drones to Russia for the war in Ukraine. So what happens in Ukraine has a huge impact on what happens globally going forward.
I want to go back just a little bit and talk about the aid package that you mentioned that Congress was able to get passed. It was brutal to get it through Congress and get it to the president's desk. Has this become such a partisan issue that you think aid for Ukraine wouldn't be able to make it through again? Are we ever going to invest again in Ukraine?
Well, in fact, it was a very bipartisan issue.
Yeah.
It got through the House after some naysaying by the farthest right wing of the Republican Party with strong bipartisan vote. It also got through the Senate with a very strong bipartisan vote. And so I think that there's been a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of discussion by those people who don't want to see anything positive come out of government. The Trump MAGA base that says we don't want to do anything to support our allies around the world. But reality has been that there's been strong bipartisan support to get this done. Let's
turn to NATO now. I know the 75th anniversary is coming up. I believe that's being held over here, the celebration at least,
right,
here in the United States. I want to go to a research poll that was done by the Pew Research poll. You can see here 58% of Americans, they support NATO, 75% of Democrats support, but just 43% of Republicans surveyed have a positive view of NATO. Now, are you worried that NATO could become a partisan issue as well?
Well, that's one of the things we've worked very hard to address.
Yeah.
Back in 2018, Tom Tillis, a Republican from North Carolina, and I restarted something called the Senate NATO Observer Group, which has been a group of senators designed to try and make sure that members of the Senate know what's happening at NATO and address any concerns that people have. We were very involved in supporting the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO. North Macedonia, the last NATO member before Finland and Sweden. So I think our goal is to ensure that people continue, both parties continue to support NATO.
What is the risk to NATO if Donald Trump gets a second term?
Well, again, NATO has strong bipartisan support in Congress. And one of the things we did was to say in the last session of Congress that a president can't unilaterally take us out of NATO. It requires confirmation from the Senate. So I think whoever the next president is, NATO is going to continue to be very strong because NATO is the strongest military alliance in history. It has been significant in maintaining peace globally and in Europe for 70 years until Putin invaded Ukraine. And the response from NATO has been so critical in supporting Ukraine in this effort, this unjust war against Russia.
All right, let's turn over to another conflict that the world is watching, that being in Gaza, Israel and Hamas that have been fighting now since October 7th. We know right now Bibi Netanyahu is in charge of that country. As you watch this conflict unfold, is he the right man for this moment? And what have you made of the decisions that he's made so far?
Well, he's been very responsive to his right-wing coalition, and we saw that the more central members of the coalition have resigned in recent weeks. And it's unfortunate that he has been so unwilling to look at what happens next at the end of this war, that he has continued to, while the pressure from the United States has been really important, I think, in trying to tamp down their response in Rafah in Gaza, The bombing has continued. The humanitarian aid has continued to be stalled. We know that there are about 1 million people in Gaza who are at risk of famine in the country. Most of the people affected have been women and children. So the Prime Minister needs to think about what happens next, and he's not been willing to talk about that. He's not been willing to look at a ceasefire that will allow the hostages to be brought home. And I think the Israeli people have gotten very concerned about the leadership that Prime Minister has provided.
He's been invited to come and speak to Congress. Is it the appropriate moment to have the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking to our Congress?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that he's going to be here. He needs to be at home thinking about what he's going to do to address ending the war in Gaza and what happens next and who's in charge. And we have a number of other Arab countries in the region who are interested in participating in what happens next in Gaza, but they want some assurances from Israel about what Israel's going to do.
Let's bring it back home now and talk about some domestic issues. Reproductive rights, paramountly, obviously, is going to be a huge part of this election cycle. It's been a losing item for Republicans, it seems. Democrats have really put a lot of emphasis on this particular issue, and the Supreme Court's ruled twice now on major abortion cases. So where do you see right now where we stand with reproductive rights in this country, given all that I just said, all the different factors that are at play?
Well, I think Democrats are talking about it because the women of this country are talking about it, as are the men. Never in my lifetime has the country rolled back the rights of our citizens in the same way that the Supreme Court did, rolling back the ability of women to make our own decisions about our own bodies, about when to start a family, about how big to make our family. That's a decision that should be made by women in consultation with their family, with their minister, with their medical provider. It should not be made by some old white man on the Supreme Court. It should not be made by some politician in Washington or Concord, New Hampshire, or Boston in the State House. And I think women have spoken loudly and clearly that this is not something that we want to see. I don't want my 3 granddaughters to have fewer rights than my 3 daughters had at their age. And right now, that's the case. So we know the Republicans aren't going to stop with abortion. They're looking at contraception. They're looking at IVF. And they're invading people's private bedrooms in ways that we haven't seen in my lifetime.
And I wonder with the Supreme Court cases and the rulings that they put out, I mean, does that bring you any comfort considering the first one on mifepristone was more about the standing of the issue, that's why it was tossed out, and the second one was because they didn't feel like it should have risen up to the Supreme Court at that point at all?
No, it doesn't give me any satisfaction because they've been very clear that they're looking at ways to, as Clarence Thomas said, we think that there are other precedents that we're going to look at with respect to contraceptives, with respect to other decisions around reproductive rights. And the problem is that it's women who are getting hurt. We had a rally in Concord, New Hampshire on Monday night, and one of the women who spoke was from Texas. And she talked about what had happened because she had a pregnancy that miscarried. She couldn't get the care after that she needed. She had to be on the verge of death almost before she could get care. That's not right, and women are going to die because of this.
Let's move over to child care now. I know that's something that is a big priority for you. I believe you have a bill that sort of focuses on service members in particular and their ability to afford child care. This came up in the debate last night as well. How big of an issue right now is this for American families?
It's huge. Every company I've been to since the end of COVID, really since the middle of COVID, has talked about the concern for child care. Women and men can't get back into the workforce if they don't have somebody who can take care of their children, who they feel are going to make sure that their kids are safe and secure. And so we have got to do a better job. And Men and women who are serving in the military are particularly at risk for child care because they're expected to go on deployments. For our National Guard members, they have to leave at hours before and after child care centers are open. So it's a huge challenge. We have a really interesting pilot program that we're doing in the seacoast of New Hampshire with the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and the National Guard, where they're jointly doing a child care center.
Wow. I know with your bill there, it seems like every bill, you never really know where it is in the process. So where does it stand right now? When could service members see something like this become a reality?
Well, the legislation that we had would allow DOD to partner with groups like AmeriCorps, because one of the big challenges with child care is the staffing. And one of the reasons we have a problem with staffing is because we are not paying what the market really requires to ensure that we have the people we want taking care of our kids. So what this would do is allow DOD to partner with AmeriCorps to help encourage different staffing models. And right now it's in the defense bill that was marked up and came out of committee. We expect that to go to the floor of the Senate in July.
So let's bring it hyper-local now. Let's go back all the way to New Hampshire, from international to country, straight to the state level. We know Governor Governorunu is going to be wrapping up his term, his time in the governor's mansion. You certainly spent time as governor as well. And your two families, really, if you look at it, I mean, those are the two families in New Hampshire politics. What's the relationship between the Shaheens, the Sununus, you, Chris Sununu?
Well, Chris and I have worked together. Obviously, he's been governor of the time that I've been in the Senate. And so it's important that we work together to address the needs of the state.
Do you think he's done a good job?
You know, it depends on the issue. The place where I was disappointed in Governor Sununu was we've had a lot of funding at the federal level that has come to the state over the last 4 years, really since COVID. The American Rescue Plan, the funding for food for children who are at risk of hunger, funding for housing. And sadly, New Hampshire has not taken advantage of all of those funds. The state has sent money back to help address hunger. They've sent money back for housing. And it's been disappointing to me to see that this was an opportunity to really lay a foundation in some areas of real need for the state. And I think we could have taken better advantage of it. One
last topic I wanted to get to was to talk a little bit about Jimmy Carter. I know you worked on his campaign back in 1976. He's been in hospice care now for, I believe, about 1.5 years. What do you just can tell us about Jimmy Carter, the person that you knew back in 1976 through the years and as he nears the end of his life?
You know, I got involved in politics working for Jimmy Carter. I was impressed with him. I was teaching in a newly integrated school in Mississippi. At the time, he got elected governor of Georgia and gave his famous speech about the need to end segregation in the South. So when he was running for president, my husband and I were back in New Hampshire, and we went to the first campaign meeting his campaign had in New Hampshire in 1975. And I have always been proud of my support for Jimmy Carter, of the job that he did as president and what he's done since. He really set an example, a role model for what ex-presidents can do and the difference they can continue to make in the world.
You've led me well into my next question, which is I feel like throughout my life, I've heard people look back on the Carter years with somewhat negativity in terms of his presidency itself. But do you think in the years that have followed that his presidency has actually sort of grown with more favor as the years have gone by?
I do. I think more and more people have understood the kinds of things that Jimmy Carter put in place. I mean, for example, on energy, he was way ahead of the rest of the country on the need to address our energy crisis and to get off fossil fuels and to look at alternative sources of energy. His appointment of women and people of color to posts, not only judgeships, but to posts throughout the government was really, again, foundational in terms of what has happened since then. His recognition of the global role of the United States in the world. So he, I think, put in place so many things that have had an impact now in the way that we do business with the government.
Well, Senator Shaheen, thanks so much for going through all those different topics with us. We sure appreciate it.
Nice to be with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, up next, a look back at a memorable debate that left many viewers disappointed. Coming up, Sue O'Connell is going to join us with her take on Biden, on Trump, facing off once again, and just how worried Democrats are about the president's performance. That's next.
Look, I'd be happy to have a driving contest with him. The reason I got my handicap, which when I was vice president, down to a 6.
That's the biggest lie, that he's a 6 handicap of all.
I was an 8 handicap.
Yeah.
8.
Never.
But I have, you know how many?
I've seen you swing. I know you swing.
Yeah, that was the two major party candidates for president debating their golf performances during the first presidential debate. That being one of the strangest moments of the night. There were issues of substance discussed last Thursday: Ukraine, abortion policy. Two things stood out afterwards: the lack of fact-checking of the candidates, particularly Donald Trump, and President Biden's shaky performance. What was the impression left by the president? This was the headline on NBCnews.com Friday morning. Quote, "Some Democrats call for Biden to step aside and throw in the towel on 2024. Joining us with her take is Sue O'Connell, in all places Dedham. Can't imagine what you're doing there, Sue, but let's get to the debate itself. What was your take on everything that took place Thursday?
Matt, it was just hard to watch, hard to believe that these are our choices for as we get right into the campaign season. First, I want to say I'm glad we had this debate early as opposed to the later debates. I think that's something we should repeat. I am glad that the presidential campaign, the people who are in charge of the debates in the past were not in charge of this. That's good news. I also want to just say before we start talking, you know, Donald Trump is a convicted felon. He stood up there and lied. But that's what we expected, right? What we didn't expect was Joe Biden, President Joe Biden, after a pretty good performance when he delivered the State of the Union at the beginning of the year, to come up and just be living what I think many Democrats think is their worst fear. The only worst thing that could have happened, or as my daughter used to say when she was little, the only worser thing that could have happened was if he had actually fallen getting up to the stage. It's, I think, an all-around a disaster for the Democrats. It's a disaster for Joe Biden. And somehow, you know, former President Trump was able to control himself and kind of let Joe Biden go forward. And Matt, I think that if you read the transcript of what Joe Biden was saying, it would harken back a little bit to the Nixon-Kennedy debates, where if you actually heard Nixon, he wasn't as bad as if you watched him. But unfortunately, we were watching this, and it's just a disaster.
Yeah, those parallels back to that debate draw themselves for sure. Obviously, Friday morning, pretty much any Democrat was being asked the same question, was whether their party needed to make a transition, to shift to a different candidate for the 2024 election. In your mind, do Democrats have the courage? Do they have the ability at this point, with 60-plus days until the convention, to make that shift?
Well, like you said, we're hearing from people who love Joe Biden, who have been working with or for Joe Biden for many, many years, who are now saying out loud what many voters and many people who care about this, you know, this whole system from the get-go have been thinking. You know, the question is, would it be time maybe to urge Joe Biden to resign and allow Vice President Kamala Harris to become the president, and then have Donald Trump have to run against Kamala Harris, the first black woman, the first woman of Asian descent to be the president? Would that be the best route? I imagine all this week and into July, there's going to be a lot of discussions about this. I've heard from a lot of activists. I've heard from a lot of donors. It's definitely top of mind for them.
Whispers are that Joe Biden is ready to debate Donald Trump again, and plans to in September, which is when the next debate is scheduled for. Do you think that's going to happen, Sue? Are we going to see these two men back on stage?
You're terrible. Well, look, at the real thing that happens here, right, is that after a debate, the candidates usually get some sort of bump. It's usually a couple of points, and then it sort of evens out again. What may happen here is that Joe Biden will see the polls soon enough, maybe ending at a lower point. You know, I'm not sure what another debate would accomplish here. So at the moment, Trump is in the driver's seat. We'll have to see how Biden responds.
Sue O'Connell for us in Dedham. Thanks so much for your time, Sue. We appreciate it.
See you soon, Matt.
That's all the time we have for this edition of At Issue. Join us next Sunday when we take a closer look at the chaos at the Cannabis Control Commission. The state's Inspector General, Jeffrey Shapiro, asked lawmakers to appoint a receiver to manage what he called a, quote, rudderless agency. He joins us in studio. Thanks for joining us. For Sue O'Connell, I'm Matt Pritchard. Enjoy the rest of your day.